Hello, learners, and welcome to the 44th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th Century Women's Novel. I have been discussing the life and work of Bessie Head, and in the previous lecture, I've provided a somewhat detailed textual analysis of A Question of Power. I will quickly wrap up our discussion of this novel and make some brief remarks on the next writer and novelist in this series, that is Marilynne Robinson, whose novel Housekeeping will be next up for discussion. So, I mentioned that in addition to the ontological status of the mind of a person, it's also important for us to think about the meaning and the value of nature, specifically cultivation of nature, specifically agriculture, and the way agriculture means a domestication of the natural world with its own laws, systems, requirements to the conveniences of human beings. The natural world is domesticated so as to be able to nourish human beings. This is a very, very important thing in the novel. It is central to Elizabeth's successful reconciliation of the tensions between her inner and outer realities. It is also very important in the literary, cultural, and political history of Southern Africa. And it is also important in terms of understanding the intersectional nature of gendered and raced identities, which I discussed earlier in this course. So I'll try and wrap up that discussion in this video. I want to quote from a book titled Pig Earth by the British art critic, novelist, and philosopher John Berger. Pig Earth is a study of French peasant life, and it's actually a critique of how many intellectuals tend to view manual labor and the lives of people who live by shaping the earth through their manual labor. And so here is what John Berger writes in Pig Earth. When a peasant resists the introduction of a new technique or method of working, it is not because he cannot see its possible advantages. His conservatism is neither blind nor lazy, but because he believes that these advantages cannot, by the nature of things, be guaranteed, and that, should they fail, he will then be cut off alone and isolated from the routine of survival. Berger writes that the peasant is committed to a view of time as cyclical. Berger writes again, and I quote, inexhaustibly committed to wresting a life from the earth, bound to the present of endless work, the peasant nevertheless sees life as an interlude. This is confirmed by his daily familiarity with the cycle of birth, life, and death. And so Berger concludes that there is something called a culture of survival, which is what the peasant lives by. And this is opposed to something that Berger calls the culture of progress, which is the perspective of the educated, elite observer or intellectual who tends to have opinions and views about what the peasant is doing. The reference to Berger is from Craig Mackenzie's work on Bessie Head, which I referred to earlier. And I think it is a very, very appropriate reference because it helps us understand exactly what is happening in the second half of A Question of Power. There are quite a few characters that are introduced, characters in the settlement in rural Botswana that Elizabeth finds herself. And some of these white Europeans, educated, elite observers, and also workers, but many of them tend to have extremely dismissive and racist views of the poor black Botswana who are there. And so this dynamic between one culture of survival, which is what the people of Botswana have been living by, and the other approach and the other perspective, which is the culture of progress, is what a lot of Elizabeth's fellow social workers try to impose in this rural community. And the novel's point, as well as Elizabeth's point, over and over, is to side with the people of Botswana and to see through and to deflate many of the hypocrisies, many of the very, very arrogant ideas that Elizabeth observed in people like Camilla, but also to some extent Tom. Camilla is one of the group of Danish scientists who are trying to set up sustainable agriculture. Camilla and Tom occupy the opposite ends of the spectrum, in which these social workers are bewildered by what they encounter in this settlement in Botswana, and they struggle to understand and appreciate what appears to them to be primitive and uneducated views of the people living there. Elizabeth's approach is to take what's valuable from this Danish group of social workers, but always to remain sensitive and empathetic and to take in as much as possible from the poor Black people of Botswana. The question of race is present on every page, and the attitudes that Elizabeth observes in most of these white social workers seems to confirm to Elizabeth some of the worst stereotypes about the essential disconnect between people from different races. And in the dreams that Elizabeth frequently sees, the character Cello, who appears like a saintly monk-like figure, appears to speak in spiritual terms of a human existence, something that transcends the racial differences. But in her daily experiences, Elizabeth is very skeptical of any such spiritual reconciliation of the difference between the races. The violence that Elizabeth suffers in her dreams, which is inflicted by characters like Dan and Medusa, who utter the most violent, stereotypical, and objectionable statements about Elizabeth's sexual, gendered, and racial identity. This violence seems to orient Elizabeth in a particular mode and makes Elizabeth much more realistic when she encounters the different attitudes among the social workers. So ultimately, Elizabeth's lesson is to become an extremely pragmatic community builder where she tolerates the racism of most of these white characters, but ultimately immerses herself not so much in fixing the racial attitudes of people around her as in making of herself and of others around her human beings who are attuned to the realities of the soil, which is to say, gardening emerges, and specifically the cultivation of vegetables, the cultivation of vegetables that can sustain the lives of human beings who do not have a great deal of material resources. In fact, the region doesn't even have water. So, in such a difficult and hostile culture and soil, the ability to cultivate vegetables becomes for Elizabeth a more virtuous and ethical act than even the cultural or the racial education of human beings. Education itself begins to appear an unnecessary and somewhat elite reality compared to with which the cultivation of vegetables is deemed to be superior. Now, I want to reflect a little bit on the cultural history of gardening, but also specifically the cultivation of land, and also the more generally speaking, the ownership and the management of labor on the land. It's very important to note that in the cultural history of South African literature, and especially Anglophone writing by South Africans, and especially white South Africans, there have been multiple attitudes towards the ownership of land, and specifically attitudes which describe the relationship between a subject, an emotional being, a being with an interior life, a complex inner life, subjectivity, relationship between subjectivity and land in the history of South African writing has been very fraught. There have been powerful instances of good writing, but they have often ignored or tried to not be truthful to the fact that the individuals who exerted a sense of ownership towards their land and who created a sense of identity by describing their associations or their nostalgia or their family's relationship to the land were often individuals who did not cultivate the land with their own labor. They were often individuals who owned the land, but whose ancestors, a few generations earlier, had violently dispossessed other individuals who owned the land. The tradition goes very, very far back, but in the history of Anglophone writing, one can sort of begin to see this with the work of Olive Schreiner, and the book is Story of an African Farm. Olive Schreiner's work is iconic and describes many white Africans writers' relationships with the land of South Africa. I mentioned the name of James Coetzee, and Nobel laureate, and it's also a very, very powerful writer from South Africa, James Coetzee, is also guilty to some extent of cultivating and propagating this kind of an emotional relationship to land, which is sustained by violence, maybe not violence inflicted during the lifetimes of these writers, but violence which was inflicted by the ancestors of these writers, and violence which, or at least the legacies of which, these writers have inherited. In mid to late 20th century South African writing about land, there is a great deal of critique of this very violent racial ownership of land, and there is also a great deal of talk about reparations. By reparations, it means that the people who were dispossessed or whose ancestors were dispossessed and who are now reduced to merely laboring on the land instead of owning the land, and who therefore are unable to assert a cultural or intellectual sense of ownership or attachment to the land, should be given a material ownership of the land. A novel that came out a few years ago, The Promise by Damon Galgut, very powerfully stages the different attitudes towards the land held by different characters within one big family. In fact, the novel is about a promise made by a dying matriarch that she would donate the entirety of this huge, sprawling country estate in South Africa to the black caretaker of the family, that is Salome. And Damon Galgut in that novel very powerfully references centuries of South African writing about land, going back at least as far as Olive Schreiner, but also referring to other powerful novels like The Conservationist by Nadine Gordimer and Disgrace by James Coetzee. Why am I referring to all of these texts? There is a relationship to land that is described in A Question of Power as well. There's also a great deal of psychological anguish that is produced through the kind of relationship that the protagonist finds herself in. When the novel begins, Elizabeth's relationship to the land is a source of pain, disturbance, and discomfort. This is because Elizabeth has not been able to reconcile her identity, her biracial identity, to the criminalizing tendencies that exist in apartheid South Africa. By the time the novel ends, however, Elizabeth has achieved a different relationship. She has left South Africa, of course, but she's not too far from the apartheid era racial pathologization of human relations. Botswana is not completely free of those apartheid era laws. Those anti-black attitudes exist even in the group of social workers where Elizabeth finds herself. How then does Elizabeth achieve a better relationship through the land? Or how does Elizabeth's immersion in cultivation, especially the cultivation of vegetables, how and why does that become the catalyst of a better relationship? And for that, I will read a quote from the second half of A Question of Power. This is what the narrator, speaking from Elizabeth's perspective, writes while describing the therapeutic, reparative influence of gardening on Elizabeth. It is impossible to become a vegetable gardener without at the same time coming into contact with the wonderful strangeness of human nature. Every man and woman is, in some way, an amateur gardener at heart, and vegetables are really the central part of the daily diet. So it is this statement, or it is this expression, that every man and woman is, in some way, an amateur gardener at heart, which I find very striking and something that connects this novel to other powerful instances of writing in the history of Anglophone South African literature. The novel that this most powerfully connects with is a novel that was published less than 10 years after this novel was published, and that one is Life and Times of Michael Kay by J.M. Coetzee. That novel is a much more direct, allegorical, but direct treatment and commentary on apartheid and the kind of civil unrest that apartheid produced in South Africa. That novel is something that comes to mind because it is also very powerfully about a gardener. It is also very powerfully about an individual who reduces his expectations from life very, very radically and sets his goal simply to have a patch of a vegetable garden where he would grow some pumpkins. That individual is Michael Kay, and the novel by J.M. Coetzee very powerfully reflects on the meaning of human identity and very powerfully rejects certain conceptions of human identity through the image of gardening. Michael Kay's immersion in gardening, his obsession with gardening, his denial of the violence that is unfolding all around him, and instead his singular focus on simply having a vegetable garden amounts to a critique of many attempts to define humanity in terms of political power and in terms of racial superiority, and through the many other ways in which political humanity was defined in the late 20th century in South Africa. Now, I have to note that the novelist Nadine Gordimer wrote a very harsh and very critical review of Life and Times of Michael Kay in the New York Review of Books Journal, in which she argued that it must be nice or privileged for some writers to dream about gardening at a time that their country was being burned down by apartheid. And that's a fair criticism because it's an allegorical novel. So in a way, the novelist cops out of making a direct comment on the morality or immorality of apartheid and expects readers to arrive at their opinions on the meaning of apartheid by reading about what this character is doing with his garden. That said, Bessie Head's A Question of Power is not subject to that kind of a critique because it is about an individual who very literally finds balance, who very literally finds stability through her immersion in this act of gardening. As I wrap up this novel, I want to briefly mention a couple of other texts which also connect identity, and specifically the identity of women protagonists, with plant life, or with the kind of existence that human beings imagine plants to have. The text that comes to mind most powerfully is the South Korean novelist Han Kang's The Vegetarian, in which a woman's imagination of what it is to be a plant amounts, or is projected, or is offered as a critique of the kind of relationships that exist between men and women in the contemporary South Korea. Now, it must be said that these are only two texts, and there are multiple. There are many, many texts. And in this very course, we have seen in a novel that was written as early as I think, 1914, which is Juna Barnes's Nightwood. We have seen how in the description of each of the female protagonists, the narrator invokes different parts of plants, whether it is branches, leaves, the texture of the bark. And so we continue that tradition. But of course, we continue that tradition, and we see how that tradition, or how that trope is also very powerfully complicated by the racial and the cultural politics of apartheid era South Africa. I'll stop my discussion of a question of power and briefly mention that the ending of this novel is among the most evocative and the most suggestive I ever read. The novel ends with Elizabeth waking up from one of her less troubled, less nightmarish dreams. And as she wakes up, she turns to her bedside table and opens a novel that is there. And this novel is Premchand's novel Godan, titled Gift of a Cow. And the question of power ends there. Several scholars have speculated on why Bessie Head chose to end her novel with a reference to Premchand. There are no obvious parallels between the intellectual and the cultural universe that Bessie Head occupies and the one that Premchand or his novels occupy. There are some obscure and diffused similarities, which is most obviously, since I've been talking about agriculture. Agriculture and the labor through which the natural world is domesticated, the sacrifices it entails, the suffering that it entails for people who are subjected to poverty. These things are similar between the world in which Elizabeth is making her way and the world that Elizabeth, I'm sure, would be reading about in Premchand's novel Godan, or Gift of a Cow. So I'll very briefly make a few comments about Marilynne Robinson and introduce the novel Housekeeping. Marilynne Robinson is a household name. She's very, very successful, very critically acclaimed, and very active even today as we speak. We're all eagerly waiting for the next installment in her Gilead series of novels. Gilead is a novel that for which Robinson won the Pulitzer Prize in 2005, but she's also not a very prolific writer. She's known to be notoriously slow and to take her time between books. The novel that we'll be talking about in this course is titled Housekeeping and was published in the year 1980. It's sort of a classic in terms of how well-known it is, how successful it is, and also how critically acclaimed it is. Something that's not very common, but there are about a handful of novels like Housekeeping who enjoy a very good critical reception, as well as are very beloved by readers. Beloved is a novel that also enjoys that kind of status. Now, Housekeeping is quite literally about domestic realism. It's seen as a sort of feminist description of domestic reality. But as I'll argue, that reading is too simplistic. There's a lot that's going on in this novel, which ostensibly is about a house that is inhabited for some reason only by women. The novel begins when two young women who've been raised only by women because for some reason their grandfather died and then their father wouldn't stay. And so they are raised by their grandmother first and then by one aunt, and then the first aunt disappears and then the second aunt appears. And so when the novel begins, these two women, Ruth and Lucille, Ruth is the narrator of the novel, are reflecting on the most recent in a series of women caretakers, and that is Sylvia. Sylvia has just come to take care of them, and Ruth and Lucille ask Sylvia why their mother, Helen, committed suicide. This is how the novel begins. And they also know that Helen was a stamp collector. She collected postal stamps. The novel describes many attitudes towards the labor of maintaining a house, and it describes individuals who occupy different positions in that spectrum. Some individuals very lovingly take care of the house, some individuals abandon the house and leave home. Between these two extremes, the novel does a great deal of intellectual and emotional work, which I will discuss in the next lecture. Thank you.